Welcome back to another video. My name is Gareth from Pole Cameras, as it always is, and today we're going to be talking reasonably candidly about the differences between the Sony a7R V and the Sony a1. And the reason I kind of started thinking about this and I wanted to make this video was recently, obviously, we reviewed the a7R V. That came out only a few weeks ago, whereas the a1 came out a little while ago. We've reviewed both of them. I'll pop the links down in the description for the full reviews. But it got me thinking about the a7R V and how it sometimes feels like it's pushing for that flagship camera status. And in a lot of ways, of course, the a1 is the flagship camera, but the a7R V, it actually seems like it outperforms the a1 in certain areas. So let's talk about it, because if you were looking to upgrade or you were looking to get into the Sony ecosystem and you wanted to go for that flagship camera, which one would you pick? Now, I make no secret about the fact that I'm somewhat of a Sony shooter. I, of course, use all kinds of brands, but I use a lot of Sony cameras. Right now, I'm shooting on the a7 III. So this is actually something that applies to me. I will be looking to upgrade soon. And so this is an important question. Which is the camera to go for? Now, of course, it does depend a little bit on the kind of stuff that you shoot, whether you're a hybrid shooter, photography, video. What you actually shoot is a big part of the deciding process of what camera to get. But we can talk about the spec, we can talk about the differences, and then I'm going to give you my honest opinion on which camera I would choose and why. So let's get into it. Let's look at some of the spec. Let's start with the megapixel count, the resolution, the sensor, all of that stuff. Let's start with the resolution. So of course, these are both high resolution cameras. The a7R V does take the win on this one, but they're both very high. 50 megapixels on the a1, 61 megapixels on the a7R V. Now, realistically, that does mean you could crop a little bit more with the a7R V. You could get a little bit more detail out of that, but practically in the real world, I don't think you're going to see much of a difference when you're actually using these. Even when you get into editing and you start cropping, yes, like I say, you could crop a little bit more with the a7R V, but again, I just don't think you're going to notice that much of a difference. So while the a7R V is a higher resolution camera, it doesn't necessarily matter as much as it may sound like it does. What does matter is the type of sensor that both cameras are using. And the a1 uses a back illuminated CMOS stacked sensor, which gives it faster performance. We've got faster burst shooting. And with that slightly lower megapixel count, it might be slightly better with low light, but to be totally honest with you, the a7R V is also fantastic with low light. So that's something that, again, I don't think you'll notice that much of a difference on. While we're talking about resolution, both cameras are capable of using the pixel shift mode, which gives you an extremely high resolution shot by taking multiple photos, just moving the sensor and then stitching those together. With the a7R V, it's 241 megapixels, and with the a1, it's 199 megapixels. Again, those are both two alarmingly high megapixel counts that you probably won't notice the difference on. I mean, I can't see a situation where you'd need to use that outside of some very, very specific situations. And if you do need to use that, I think 241 megapixels, 199, both of those are absolutely fine. That's a lot. That's a lot of detail. Now, where we do see a big difference is in the speed of these cameras. And the Sony a1 can shoot at 30 frames a second, whereas the a7R V, it's 10 frames a second. Now, the buffer sizes differ a little bit. The a1 can store somewhere in the vicinity of 500 images before it starts slowing down. The a7R V can do 583 compressed RAW images or 1000 plus JPEG images. So it's a bit of a weird one. The buffer on the a7R V almost feels bigger than on the a1, but I don't know if that's just because of the speed of things. I mean, 30 frames a second is very, very fast. Now, of course, you would want to be using the CF Express Type A card on the Sony a1, or realistically the a7R V as well, to make the most out of that speed. So certainly the a1 is a much faster camera, but what about autofocus? This is an area that is really interesting because the a7R V has some big upgrades to autofocus in terms of AI subject detection and just generally how it works. The a7R V may have slightly fewer autofocus points, so it's 693 versus 759 on the a1. It also has 79% coverage of the whole sensor on the a7R V, whereas the a1 has 92% coverage. But practically, that probably doesn't matter as much as the other stuff that we're about to talk about. Practically speaking, 693 autofocus points is still more than enough, and 79% coverage is still pretty good. I mean, that's most of the sensor, and I don't know if you'd actually notice the difference out to 92% from 79%. Both cameras can focus down to -4 EV, so that's great for low light, but where we do see an advantage in the A7R5 is this subject detection. So the A7R5 has new deep learning AI, which just makes it so much better at subject detection. Whether that is people, where it is now able to recognize the poses of people and the way someone would stand or move, so it can actually detect a person, even if it can't see their face or their eye, it can actually follow them around the frame, so it can track a person just based on the movement and the shape of a person, which sounds pretty obvious, but actually this is pretty big stuff. It is just much better at detecting subjects. It's also better with animal eye autofocus and tracking animals, and it has new subjects added in like trains and things like that. The A1 is obviously no slouch for autofocus, but it doesn't have these newest updates that the A7R5 has. Now, I'll be totally honest with you, I've never had a problem in the last, I don't even know how many years. I mean, even with the Sony a7 III, I don't have a problem with autofocus. It just works very well with Sony cameras. And for me, at least, they've been realistically the best out there with autofocus for a good long while. So it's nice to see them continually adding and improving on these autofocus kind of techniques and systems. But to be honest, you're not going to have a bad time with the A1. But it is interesting to note that the A7R5 has that kind of added ability. This is pure speculation. Is this something that might get added into the A1 in a future firmware update? I don't know. I don't know if that's possible, but if it is, Sony have always been very, very good with firmware updates, really adding in all kinds of stuff. My a7 III has been, really updated with things like interval shooting for time lapses with animal eye autofocus, which is really impressive because that's something they could leave for their newest cameras, but they do come back and add stuff into older cameras. So who knows? That is something that could happen, but for now at least, and I don't know anything, for now at least, the A7R5 does have a little bit of an edge there. Somewhere else the A7R5 has a bit of an edge is in terms of the in-body image stabilization, which is really interesting. This is something that Sony have been not bad at all, but a little bit behind some of their competitors. So generally you see 5.5 stops, and the A1 has 5.5 stops, and it works, it's fine, but it's just not the best we've ever seen. Whereas the A7R5 has a new design for the in-body image stabilization, and it's up to 8 stops. And it is noticeable that it works better. Now, that's great for handheld shooting with a lower shutter speed. And that's great for handheld video as well, something which we're going to talk about. So again, the image stabilization, slightly better on the A7R5. Now let's talk about video, because this is an interesting topic as well. Both cameras are able to shoot in 8K. The A1 can shoot up to 30 frames a second, whereas the A7R5, it's 24 or 25 frames a second. The A1 can also shoot 4K 120 frames a second. This is 10-bit 422 and 1080p 240 frames a second. And there's also able to output ProRes RAW external. Now the A7R5 is certainly a big upgrade in terms of video from the A7R4, but it's not quite there with the A1. So again, like I say, you've got the 8K 24, 25 frames a second, 4K 60, so not 120, and there is a 1.2 times crop there as well. It's able to do 10-bit 422, which like I say is a big upgrade from the A7R4, and it's able to do 1080p up to 120 frames a second or 4K up to 30 with no crop. It's also able to output ProRes RAW external. It's got things like S-Cinetone and focus breathing compensation. So it's got some really nice stuff in there and some really good video mode. So you could really do some professional video work with the A7R5. It just doesn't quite have the same chops as the A1. That 4K 120 for a lot of videographers, if video is a big part of what you do, that 4K 120 will be a big deal. Design-wise, these cameras are really similar. So the A7R5 feels very similar to an A1. It's very slightly thicker just because of the way the screen kind of tilts. It has a new anti-dust system as well, but both of them have that system where there's a shutter over the sensor when the camera is opened, which is great because, especially on older Sony cameras, A7 III, you take a lens off, there's dust. There's dust in there immediately. The sensor's right there. So it's great. Both those cameras are pretty good now with dust, but the A7R5 does have a new anti-dust system as well. Now the EVF is very, very similar for both cameras, 9.44 million dots, and it's an OLED as well. Probably one of the nicest EVFs I've ever used. It's 120 frames a second for the A7R5. It's 240 frames a second on the A1, which is important, but it's maybe not as noticeable as a jump from 60 frames a second up to 120. 120 to 240, I think you probably would still notice it, but both look fantastic. I mean, really, really good. As the EVFs go, like I say, probably some of the best I've ever used. The LCD screen on both are very nice as well. And again, this is probably an area the A7R5 does take the win a little bit. It's a 3.2-inch screen versus a 3-inch on the A1. And the resolution is slightly higher on the A7R5, 2095K dot, whereas the A1 is 1440K dot. And you've also got that new 4-axis tilt mechanism on the A7R5 as well. Both cameras take two CF Express Type A cards or UHS-2 SD cards. You have the same battery performance as well. They're both able to do remote tethering, wireless LAN, USB, or be used as a webcam. So there's not much difference there. So overall, you do see some new technology in the A7R5, which isn't in the A1. And I think that's really interesting. The A7R5 feels like a very premium camera, and in a lot of ways feels like a flagship camera. Now, of course, the A1 has some advantages in terms of speed. It'll do better sort of 4K 120 video, stuff like that. So if you are someone who is shooting high-speed stuff, sports, wildlife, plus you want to shoot video, including maybe of sports or something like that, that slow motion 4K is going to be really, really crucial. That's really good. And then that speed of 30 frames a second is huge. If you don't do those things, I'd probably lean towards the A7R5, if I'm totally honest. If I was going to buy one of these cameras, you know, I've thought about buying the A1 for a long time, but if I was going to buy one of these now, I'd probably choose the A7R5. That's partly because of how I shoot and how I would use the camera, which is I don't really do a lot of sports. I mean, I don't do any sports, but I don't really do a lot of wildlife. I wouldn't get much use out of that speed. And while 4K 120 frames a second was something that I absolutely craved for so long, I don't think I'd get the use out of it that at one point I would. I think I've moved on from being obsessed with 120 frames a second. So I think 4K 60 would be fine. I think 1080p 120 would be fine, because something to consider, of course, is the price difference as well. And there is a pretty significant difference at the moment, at least, between these two cameras. So while I don't usually go into pricing that much on camera reviews or camera comparisons like this, it's really important, I think, for something like this. And at the moment, you are looking at a couple of £1,000 difference between these two cameras, with the A1 being couple of £1,000 more expensive, and that is something really important to consider. And for me, that would absolutely put me over towards the A7R5, which I think is such a fantastic camera. It's very much a photography camera, kind of on paper, but for me, it feels perfectly capable as a hybrid camera as well. The video specs on this and the video performance, you know, I used it a bit for video when I was reviewing it, is absolutely, it's outstanding. It's really, really good. And you cannot go wrong with either of these cameras. Either of these cameras is going to give you such a nice experience. But for me personally, I think probably I would lean towards the A7R5. I'd love to know what you would pick. Which one would you go for and why? What's important to you on these cameras? Of course, you can check out both the cameras, the full spec, the pricing, all that stuff by clicking the links down in the description. There's new content every single week, tutorials, reviews, all kinds of stuff. So make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, and of course, subscribe for more videos in the future. I will see you then, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.